I was being brought to set in a wheelchair. Like, I couldn't walk that far. So I had to tell everybody because I needed help. You know, I needed someone to help me stand, and I needed someone to help. I needed someone to help me to get there.
There are things that happen on television sets that the cameras never capture. Relationships that form in the spaces between takes and table reads and late-night rap times that never make it into any interview or press junket or official account of how a show was made. For 37 years, the most important of those relationships from the set of Married with Children existed almost entirely outside public knowledge. Fans knew the show. They knew the characters. They knew the broad outlines of what the production had been. But what Christina Applegate had begun revealing in the period following her recent reunion with the cast is something that reframes the entire story of one of the most controversial and enduring sitcoms in American television history. What she has exposed about Ed O'Neill is not a scandal. It is not a betrayal or a controversy or any of the things that the word exposed tends to signal when it appears in a headline. It is something considerably rarer and considerably more meaningful than any of those things. It is the truth about a man who looked at a 15-year-old girl walking onto the most provocative set in network television and made a decision, without being asked and without any formal obligation to do so, to make sure she was protected. And it is the truth about what that decision meant across the 37 years that followed. The context in which that decision was made matters enormously and is not always fully appreciated by people who encountered Married with Children primarily through reruns or streaming rather than through a specific cultural moment of its original broadcast. When the show debuted in 1987, it was deliberately and comprehensively transgressive. Fox had launched it as a direct challenge to the wholesome family sitcoms that dominated primetime, and it operated by inverting every value those shows embodied. The family was dysfunctional. The humor was crude. The characters said and did things that network television had never permitted in a family format, and the show wore that transgression as its central identity rather than treating it as an occasional edge to be carefully managed. At the center of all of this, playing a character written explicitly as a teenage sex symbol, surrounded by adult humor and adult energy, and the kind of attention that such a character in such a show inevitably generated, was a 15-year-old girl who was still figuring out who she was. Ed O'Neill was in his early 40s when production began. He had navigated enough of Hollywood-specific and sometimes brutal terrain to understand what environments like that set could do to young people, particularly young women, who were thrust into them without adequate protection. He had seen what happened when nobody was looking out for someone in that position. And so, he looked out for Christina, not as a formal arrangement and not as something he announced or sought recognition for, but simply as a consistent daily practice of genuine care. He would step into conversations that were drifting somewhere, inappropriate around her, and redirect them without making a scene of the redirection. He would position himself near her during scenes that had the potential to become uncomfortable. He would drive her home after late-night shoots rather than leave her to travel alone. He called her mother to offer reassurances that her daughter was being looked after in an environment that the mother had every reason to be concerned about. When producers pushed for Christina to be placed in situations that she found uncomfortable, Ed pushed back. None of this was in his contract. None of it was part of his job description. It was simply who he chose to be when the circumstances placed a vulnerable young person in his vicinity and gave him the option of either noticing or looking away. Christina has described the experience of working within that protection without always fully understanding what it was when she was living inside it. She was 15, and 15-year-olds do not typically have a framework to recognize protective care for exactly what it is in the moment it is being provided. What she knew was that the set felt safer than it had any particular reason to feel given what the show was doing. What she understood, in the more immediate sense that teenagers understand things, was that Ed was steady and reliable and present in a way that the environment did not technically require him to be. The full understanding of what that had meant came later, with a perspective that distance and experience provide, and it is that fuller understanding that she has been sharing in recent years with clarity and a specificity that people who thought they knew the Married with Children story have found genuinely surprising. The first major test of what had been built between them came in 1989, 2 years into production, when a Michigan woman named Terry Ricalta watched an episode of the show and decided to make its cancellation her personal mission. She launched an advertiser boycott that worked with frightening speed. Coca-Cola pulled their advertising. McDonald's followed. dozens of other major sponsors withdrew their support within weeks. The network entered emergency mode. Executive conversations about simply ending production were not hypothetical. They were genuine assessments of whether continuing the show was worth the commercial and reputational cost. For Christina, who was 17 years old and for whom the show represented not just her current employment, but her entire professional identity and future, the uncertainty was a kind of fear that lodges in the body rather than simply in the mind. Everything she had worked toward was potentially about to be taken away because of a campaign she had no power to influence. Ed O'Neill did not allow that fear to sit unaddressed. While executives were calculating risk in conference rooms and the network's public position was carefully managed, Ed was sitting down with Christina and with David Faustino, who played her brother Bud, and telling them directly that what they had made together was worth being proud of regardless of what the network decided. He was giving them a framework for understanding the situation that did not require the show's survival to justify the work they had done. He also went to the press himself, which was a more exposed and more deliberately visible form of support. He gave interviews defending the program, but he framed those defenses consistently around the young people working on it rather than around the show's abstract right to exist. He was making sure that in every public conversation about the controversy, someone was explicitly speaking up for his television children. The boycott ultimately produced one of the more ironic outcomes in television history. The negative attention it generated introduced millions of curious viewers to a show they had never watched, and ratings climbed to heights the production had never previously reached. But what Christina has said, repeatedly and with specificity, is that the ratings outcome is not what she remembers from that period. What she remembers is Ed being steady when everyone around her was panicking, and the particular kind of safety that steadiness provided when she was 17 years old and genuinely frightened. The show ran for 11 seasons before ending in 1997, without the ceremony that the length of its run might have warranted. There was no finale built to provide closure for the characters or the actors. Production simply stopped, and the family that had assembled in that building every working day for more than a decade scattered in the sudden and disorienting way that long television productions end when the decision arrives without adequate preparation. Christina has described the strangeness of that transition with a specificity that reflects how genuinely disorienting it was. One day there was a routine, a place to go, people who knew you in a specific and intimate way that only years of shared daily work produces. The next day, all of that was simply gone, without graduation and without ceremony. What she has also revealed is that for her and Ed specifically, the ending of the show did not translate into the ending of what existed between them. They maintained their connection after the cameras stopped. Phone calls, meals, the particular ongoing attention that Ed paid to her career even after the professional context that had initially structured their relationship no longer existed. The television father and daughter had become something real, and real things do not simply dissolve when the production that created their initial context is canceled. Christina built a remarkable post-married with children career across films and other television series, earning critical recognition that confirmed what Ed had always understood about her potential. Ed built his own second act in Modern Family, a show that brought him a new generation of fans, and a level of awards recognition that reflected the full range of what he was capable of as a performer. When interviewers asked him about career highlights during the Modern Family years, he would return consistently to Christina, to watching her develop from the teenager he had first encountered to the formidable actress she had become. He was not taking credit for her success. He was simply expressing the specific and unperformable pride of someone who had been present for the beginning of something and had watched it become what it was always capable of being. On August 10th, 2021, Christina announced on social media that she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The disease affects the central nervous system and has no cure. Its symptoms, which for Christina include mobility challenges significant enough that she now uses a cane, cognitive fog, and the daily reality of a body that behaves differently than the one she had always inhabited, required a complete restructuring of her life at a level that went far beyond professional adjustment. She has spoken about the grief this produced with honesty that has been remarkable in its completeness. Grief for the future she had imagined, for the version of herself that existed before the diagnosis, for a particular kind of freedom that a body without chronic illness provides, and that she could no longer take for granted. The emotional dimension of the diagnosis was inseparable from its physical reality, and navigating both simultaneously, while also being a public figure, meant that the grief could not simply be processed in private. Ed O'Neill's response, as Christina has described it, was entirely consistent with a pattern that had been established in the first week of production in 1987. He did not send a brief message of sympathy and move on. He made certain, in the specific and deliberate way that has always characterized his attention to her, that she understood he was present. The entire Married with Children cast gathered around her in their various ways, and Christina has spoken warmly about all of it. But it is Ed's response that she returns to when describing what the support meant, because it was Ed's response that carried the weight of everything that had preceded it. He was still doing what he had always done. The show had been over for nearly 25 years, and he was still doing what he had always done. In November 2022, Christina made her first major public appearance since the diagnosis, receiving a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame while using a cane and moving more slowly than the world remembered her moving. She was there, fully and deliberately present, refusing to allow illness to define what she was willing to show the public about her own life. Her speech was emotionally unguarded in a way that people who had followed her career for decades found genuinely moving. She spoke about fear and about gratitude and about the specific meaning of having people in her life who had shown up for her when the circumstances were difficult. And in those words she was describing, among others, the man who had driven her home from late-night shoots when she was 15 years old because he did not want her traveling alone. 2 months later, at the Emmy Awards in January 2023, she walked onto stage, and the entire room stood up simultaneously without being asked or organized to do so. The ovation lasted nearly a full minute. She stood in the middle of it, visibly processing the scale of what was being directed at her, and then did what has always been the most characteristic thing about her. She made a joke. She told the audience they were shaking her brain. They laughed through whatever they'd been feeling, and the moment became something that perfectly captured who she is in a single exchange. Afterward, Ed was among the people who made sure she knew that the love in that room was real, and that it extended well beyond the evening's event. He was still being what he had decided to be on the first day of production in 1987, and the consistency of that across 37 years is the thing Christina has finally, fully, publicly exposed. What she has revealed is not complicated. It does not require extensive analysis or careful interpretation. A man with experience and authority in a difficult environment looked at a young person who needed protection and provided it, without announcement and without expectation of recognition, and then continued providing it in the forms the subsequent decades require for 37 years. The reunion that brought them back into the same room and gave Christina the occasion to finally say this clearly and publicly did not create the story. It simply gave her the platform to tell it. And the telling, as it turns out, is the most powerful thing she has ever said about who she is, because who she is was shaped in meaningful and lasting ways by what Ed O'Neill chose to be when nobody required him to be anything at all.